This is TWiT.
We are back to protecting the children. And I'm not making light of that at all. CSAM, as we know, child sexual abuse material and online exploitation of children, is so distasteful that it's difficult to talk about because that requires imagining something that you'd much rather not. But it's that power that gives this a bit of a Trojan horse ability to slip past our defenses, or at least past the politicians. Because there's also a very valid worry surrounding, this whole issue that once we've agreed to compromise our privacy for the very best of reasons, protecting children, our government or a foreign government or law enforcement might use their then available access to our no longer truly private communications against us. Now, nowhere in the EU's pending legislation, this pending surveillance legislation that I'll get to in a second, is there any mention of terrorists or terrorism, but it's been voiced before, and you can bet that it will come marching out again. And once everyone's communications is being screened for seductive content that might be considered grooming, photos that might be naughty, and other content that some automated bot thinks should be brought to a human's attention, then what's next? So this is the very definition of a slippery slope. Document number 52022 PC 0209 is titled Proposal for a Regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council laying down rules to prevent and combat child sexual abuse. Okay, first of all, it won't prevent it, right? Nothing will. What it will do is drive that material to seek other channels. And that's not a bad thing. And I agree that it would likely combat the problem, though, again, prevention, okay, to some degree, right? The question is this the best solution, and what real price are we paying to make that possible? And of course, what could possibly go wrong? So what is essentially happening is that the EU is taking the next step. Over and ignoring the loud and recently polled objections of 72% of European citizens, EU legislators are preparing to move their current content screening internet communications surveillance, which until now has been voluntary and as a consequence somewhat limited in its application, to mandatory and therefore universal. Okay, so now just to recap a bit about how we got to where we are now. 3 years ago, in 2020, the European Commission proposed temporary legislation which allowed for the automated internet communications surveillance for the purpose of screening content for CSAM, child sexual abuse material. The following summer, on July 6th of 2021, the European Parliament adopted the legislation to allow for this voluntary screening. And as a result of this adoption, which they refer to as an e-privacy derogation, in other words, creating a deliberate exception to e-privacy for this purpose, U.S.-based providers like Gmail, Outlook.com, and Meta's Facebook began voluntarily screening for this content on some of their platforms. Notably, however, only those very few providers did anything. The other providers of, for example, explicitly secure communications, Telegram, Signal, they've not done anything. And so last summer, on May 11th of 2022, the Commission presented a proposal to move this internet surveillance from it's no longer going to be temporary, and it's no longer going to be voluntary. It will be becoming mandatory for all service providers. As we noted when this was last discussed in the context of Apple's hastily abandoned proposal to provide client-local image analysis by storing the hashes of known illegal images on the user's phone, the content to be examined includes not only images, but also textual content which might be considered solicitous of minors. You know, that's that grooming term. And most controversially, all of this would impact every EU citizen, regardless of whether there was any preceding suspicion of wrongdoing. Everyone's visual and textual communications would be, and apparently will soon be, surveilled. Interestingly, the legality of this surveillance in the EU has already been challenged, and according to a judgment by the European Court of Justice, the permanent and general automatic analysis of private communications violates fundamental rights. Nevertheless, the EU now intends to adopt such legislation. For the court to subsequently annul it can take years, by which time the mandated systems will be established and in place. Currently, meetings and hearings are underway. They're going to be going on through the rest of the year. A parliamentary vote is being held next month in March, followed by various actions being taken throughout the rest of the year as required to move the sure passage of this legislation through a large bureaucracy. Why sure? After all, how does any politician defend not wishing to protect the children? I've read a great deal of this proposal, and it has been clearly written to be rigorously defensible as a Child Protection Act, period. So, how do you stand up and vote against that? It shows every indication of being adopted, with this surveillance set to become mandatory in April of next year, 2024. So some pieces from this legislation. Quote, by introducing an obligation for providers to detect, report, block, and remove child sexual abuse material from their services, the proposal enables improved detection, investigation, and prosecution of offenses under the Child Sexual Abuse Directive. Another piece. This proposal sets out targeted measures that are proportionate to the risk of misuse of a given service for online sexual abuse and are subject to robust conditions and safeguards. It also seeks to ensure that providers can meet their responsibilities by establishing a European Center to prevent and counter child sexual abuse, further, hereinafter referred to as EU Center, to facilitate and support implementation of this regulation and thus help remove obstacles to the internal market, especially in connection with the obligations of providers under this regulation to detect online child sexual abuse, report it, and remove child sexual abuse material. In particular, the EU Center will create, maintain, and operate databases of indicators of online child sexual abuse that providers will be required to use to comply with the detection obligations. Okay, why mandatory? They say the impact assessment shows that voluntary actions alone against online child sexual abuse have proven insufficient. By virtue of their adoption by a small number of providers only, of the considerable challenges encountered in the context of public-private cooperation in this field, as well as of the difficulties faced by member states, meaning EU member states, in preventing the phenomenon and guaranteeing an adequate level of assistance to victims. This situation has led to the adoption of divergent sets of measures to fight online child sexual abuse in different member states. In the absence of union action, legal fragmentation can be expected to develop further as member states introduce additional measures to address the problem at national level, creating barriers to cross-border service provision on the digital single market. And as to why they think this is a good thing, quote, these measures would significantly reduce the violation of victims' rights inherent in the circulation of material depicting their abuse. These obligations, in particular, the requirement to detect new child sexual abuse materials and grooming, would result in the identification of new victims and create a possibility for their rescue from ongoing abuse, leading to a significant positive impact on their rights and society at large. The provision of a clear legal basis for the mandatory detection and reporting of grooming would also positively impact these rights. Increased and more effective prevention efforts will also reduce the prevalence of child sexual abuse, supporting the rights of children by preventing them from being victimized. Measures to support victims in removing their images and videos would safeguard their rights to protection of private and family life, privacy, and of personal data. Okay, so this is clearly something that the EU is focused upon and is committed to seeing put into action, to be in effect in the spring of next year, 2024. And apparently the EU has a legal system, much like the one which has evolved or devolved here in the U.S., where the court system has been layered with so many checks, balances, and safeguards against misjudgments that years will then pass while challenges make their way through the courts. Meanwhile, this is mandatory starting in April. Conspicuously missing from any of this proposed legislation is any apparent thought to how exactly this will be accomplished from a technological standpoint, which of course is what interests us. You know, if I have an Android phone, whose job is it to watch and analyze what images my camera captures, what images my phone receives, what textual content I exchange? Is the phone hardware providers, is it the phone hardware provider's job, or is it the underlying Android OS's job, or is it the individual messaging application? It's difficult to see how Signal and Telegram are ever going to capitulate to this. And is it the possession of the content or the transmission, reception, and communication of the content? You know, can you record your own movies for local use, never with any intention to do anything else with them? The proposal establishes and funds this so-called EU Center to serve as a central clearinghouse for suspected illegal content and providing in some fashion the samples against which material that is seen on devices, on consumer devices in the EU, is checked against. So when an EU-based provider somehow detects something which may be proscribed, the identity and the current location of the suspected perpetrator, along with the content in question, will be forwarded to the EU Center for their analysis and further action, if any. Wow. So, as I've been saying for years, this battle over the collision of cryptography and the state's belief in its need for surveillance is going to be a mess, and it's far from over. So, Leo, it moves forward.
It makes me really think about the long-term consequences of that. And if I were Apple or Google or Samsung, or I would be fighting this tooth and nail, because in the long run, they're going to be forced to enforce it, essentially, right?
To compromise their
they're going to have to do something, yeah. And once if they do, then you're going to see a migration away from their platforms to non-proprietary open platforms, so that people don't have to subjugate themselves to this. So I think it hurts them badly. First, because they're going to have a battle over how to enforce it. Apple's already turned on advanced data protection in the U.S., which is so. And here's another question.
And now globally. It went global a couple weeks ago.
Okay. Well,
with iOS 16.3, it's now universal.
They'll be, non-compliant in the EU. And then there's the other question is, they haven't done this yet, but how long before they then make it illegal for me to encrypt everything? Right? Because they're going to stop the vendors. But what if I decide, well, I'm going to figure out a way that I'm going to pre-internet, do what you call PI, a pre-internet encryption of everything. Am I now found guilty because I must be hiding something?
I know.
I think it pushes people into a position where they do have to now start being responsible for their own encryption. They only would choose end-to-end encrypted choices. It's going to end up driving people underground and in the dark, not just criminals, but everybody who wants privacy. I think the long-term implications of this are bad all around.
I know. And so, from a technology standpoint, we have Signal and Telegram. There's just no way that Moxie is going to compromise Signal in order to allow the and be responsible for having a connection to the EU center to get a database of things it has to check its users' messages against.
And that's why I'm saying the burden of this is ending up on Apple and Google and Samsung, because what they'll have to do is take them out of the store. They'll have to say, well, we can't have Signal in the App Store, and then we've washed our hands of it. But Signal will continue to be distributed underground, and and this is what I'm saying, is ultimately, if you care about privacy, you're going to run an open platform that you control, that you put your own software. You're not going to be relying on an Apple store or an Android store. And
well, it goes a little bit further though, because the Apple could be compelled to do the filtering before Signal gets it. Remember that Signal is
No, I understand. You can't use an Apple device is what I'm saying. The burden will end up being on Apple, and Apple will, if they comply, which they probably will have to in the long run, lose customers like you and me who will say, well, I'm going to use Signal, I'm going to do encryption, and it ain't going to be on a device where I can't. So you're exactly right. That's why I'm saying this is who should be fighting this tooth and nail right now, is Apple and Google, because this is going to be not only a burden on them, it's going to require them to reverse things they've been doing, but also it's going to lose them customers. I don't know. Do most people care enough about this that they would actually? You said 72% of the EU is against it?
They're saying, yeah, we do not want this.
See, I think you can't stop encryption, right? You can only stop it on commercial platforms. You can
the math has already escaped.
Yeah. So they can't stop it. They can only tell companies, internet service providers, carriers, cell phone manufacturers to do it. So then we just say, well, I think that just creates a brisk market.
Well, remember, I was all geared up to do a product called CryptoLink years ago.
You didn't want it?
And I saw the handwriting on the wall.
You didn't want that burden.
It's a much slower march, but I didn't want to be, in a position where, where governments are saying, we have to have a back door to your secure communications technology.
Many years ago, about 20 years ago, there was a documentary which has since been suppressed about hacking, in which I gave an interview, and I said, really, it's going to be the hackers that are the freedom fighters. They're going to be the ones who are going to be protecting us from governments and corporations who are going to want to invade our privacy, take over our lives, and that open source software and hackers, people who know how to use it, are going to be the heroes. They're going to be the heroes. It's going to be up to us to protect ourselves. I don't think we should all turn into the Unabomber, but I think we're all going to have to embrace open software, because they can't stop open software.
No.
It's very difficult.
So that would mean hacking an Android device in order to sideload your own.
Not necessarily. There are already companies like Pine that make phones that are not Android or iOS. They run Linux.
Ah, okay.
So they're not very good. I keep buying them in hopes, and they're terrible. But this will stimulate their development, and eventually, just as you can buy a computer that, you don't have to have, TPM on a computer. You can buy a computer that is not,
locked down,
and put open stuff on it and control it, and that's what's going to happen. I think, at least for people who care. Maybe that's a tiny minority.
And obviously that is a diminishing minority. I mean, maybe they'll once upon a time, Uncle Willie was asking his nephew, who was the geek, what was the best computer to buy and what should you do? And so maybe it'll be like, hey, I heard about, governments are spying on everybody with their phone, Junior, what phone should I get? And then, Junior will know because he's in college and he's up on all this stuff.
There'll be a brisk market in open hardware and software, I think. And then the sad thing is then you've completely lost control. The EU just there's nothing they can do about it.
Yes, and it will be, as we've already seen, it'll be the bad guys that are driven to that platform.
Yeah.
And sadly, there is a level of false positives that occur with this. There are images which, someone who's sitting there clicking a button, snapping through images in order, the human captcha person is sitting there saying, "Whoa, what's that?" And go question this person. I mean, it's going to be horrible if that's happening.
Yeah, I've always felt like there would come a time when this stuff was computer technology was too powerful, and that governments would want to try to control it and shut it down, and that there would always be a group of us. They're called hackers, but there would always be a group of us who said, no, we're going to keep it open. We're going to keep it ours. We're going to keep their prying eyes out.
Like Neo in The Matrix.
Like The Matrix.
Who,
yep. Wow. But and they're pushing us that way, It's too bad.
Yeah.
Tech Break is brought to you by ACI Learning. Globally respected companies and agencies turn to ACI Learning year after year to help them maintain their competitive edge. Supporting organizations across audit, IT, and cybersecurity readiness, ACI Learning keeps organizations at the top of their game. Visit acilearning.com and let ACI level up your IT team.